You're listening to Secrets for Scaling, a Gecko Board podcast that explores the growth secrets of successful founders and CEOs. If you've been enjoying Secrets for Scaling, we ask that you head on over to iTunes to give us a rating or review. That way, people just like you will also discover the founder stories that we've been sharing. Thank you so much for tuning in. For this episode, we spoke with Balaji, CEO of 21 and partner at Anderson Horowitz. Hey, Balaji. Welcome to Secrets for Scaling. To kick things off, can you tell us a bit about what 21 is, who your customers are, and what your business model is?
Yeah, so basically, if you're an individual, 21 allows you to replace your public email with an inbox that pays you. So the idea is that as you receive messages, they're rank ordered by the amount of money attached and not the time received. So you're actually rank ordering messages by the value to the sender and the value to you, not just, in terms of recency. As a business, because you've got this capability, you can now finally pay people to reply to important business emails or do things like filling out surveys or completing tasks. In a word, it's paid email or a phrase. And under the hood, it's based on digital currency. One thing that relatively few people know is that digital currencies, Bitcoin in particular, were actually based on a technology called Hashcash, which was invented in the early 2000s as a way to put a stamp on email. And so decentralized digital currency actually has its roots in the idea of putting a fee on top of decentralized communication technology like email. And so we've actually, put that into practice. Our customers are both individuals who want to contact, famous people and so on, as well as companies that are doing enterprise sales, recruiting, and market research, basically anything that involves a lot of mass emailing of cold prospects. And this model is very simple. We just take a cut of transacted messages.
And can you tell us a bit about your background and how you got involved with 21?
Sure. Yeah. So my background, I am a Stanford lifer, BS, MS, PhD in electrical engineering, MS in chemical engineering. I taught computer science and stats at Stanford for several years. And then I started a genomics company called Counsel, where I was co-founder and CTO. And I did that from 2008 to 2012. It's become a very successful company, large company, more than $100 million in revenue and, pretty large. And after that, I joined Anderson Horowitz as a partner in 2013. I also taught a MOOC course online in 2013. If you heard that term, MOOC, massively open online course on startups. And that had more than 200,000 students in it. So a very large course. And then finally, I co-founded 21 in 2013, but I only took over as CEO of it in 2015, basically going to part-time at Anderson and full-time at 21 since 2015. And so that's how I'm basically, running 21.
I think it'd be great, based on your experience, to focus on goals for this conversation. So starting out, how have you defined and set meaningful goals for both 21 and for Counsel in the past?
Yeah, great question. So, when you start a company, there's this massive idea space search. For example, are you doing a genomics company? Are you doing a robotics company? Are you doing machine learning? Are you doing, dashboards like, business intelligence? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? And that is such a broad space that, you can use some numbers to sort of, kind of rank order things by kind of their current or potential market size. But even that doesn't really get you that far because, for example, with something like Uber, if you were to say, oh, here's a market size of taxis, you never have believed that they could have built such a large company. So initially, your kind of goal setting has to be qualitative. And it's probably like a 0 to 1. You kind of think, okay, I believe I can bring this up and I have some quantitative measures to say that, I can optimize this or there is a market there and so on. You have to have some quantitative. But the initial phase of doing a startup is qualitative. It's a 0 to 1 phase. And then the other aspect of it is that I think, doing startups in general, they're challenging enough that, I'm sure there's some people who can do them just for the money, but there's many other ways of making money that are lower risk and less stressful. While goal setting is certainly part of the initiation phase of a startup, there usually also has to be some ideological or motivational, inspirational, for lack of a term, spiritual component as to why you actually want to do this thing. It has to be something where, it's I believe more than money. And often that's because if this thing already existed, then you would just buy it, but then you actually have to bring it into being. And a great example of that is something like what Elon is doing with, SpaceX. He could not buy rockets that cheap. He'd actually have to go and build them. So that's like at the beginning is qualitative goal setting as well as kind of a mission-driven sort of thing. And then once you kind of get on the road, you will iterate to get a so-called lock and key fit or product market fit. And you will turn that qualitative thing into something where there is a market for it. And then at that point, once you've started getting, 10, 20, 30 customers, that's at the enterprise size, and the consumer side would probably be, a few thousands of customers or what have you. You can start to think, okay, now we've got something, we've got that initial, burst of flame. Can we start optimizing it? And the ultimate thing that you want to get to, of course, for a business is profit. And there's all kinds of subsidiary metrics then that lead into profit based on what vertical you're in. And a16z, we've got a good post on this, like 16 metrics. These are domain-specific metrics. If you're a marketplace, it's GMV. If you're a social network, it's like DAUs. There's other kinds of metrics for hardware startups and so on. And then there's, metrics that are upstream of those, like, for example, turnaround time, which impacts your GMV, and that ultimately impacts your profit. I would say, you have to start with qualitative goals. Once you get something working a little bit, you can decide when to start imposing quantitative goals. I think you asked also, what advice would you give yourself if you were starting this process all over again? I don't know if I would do it any differently because, I came out of a computer science and statistics background. So I was, quote, data-driven and doing data science before that was even like a term. So it was obvious to me, I think, relatively early on that we wanted to graph and chart almost everything and do exploratory data analysis. But certainly in 2017, it's much, much easier to be data-driven from the beginning because there's all this modern, dashboard technology like, what Gegaboard has and other companies. And so there's less of a reason to not, have metrics as soon as you can because you can just push a few buttons and get them.
I would love to unpack that a bit. To start with the 0 to 1 phase you talked about, that the why, where you're setting qualitative goals. Do you have any advice for founders on how to best communicate that and how to create the connection between that and the first quantitative goals that they set, especially when building a team?
Yeah. So, with a qualitative goal, you start out with some end state of the world that you'd like to achieve. For example, you'd like to get life extension, or you want to put people on Mars, or you want to build new cities, or you want to do something, somewhat less ambitious, like, change. You really hate the way HR is done, and so you want to change HR, or something like that, right? And usually it springs from, some sort of passion for it, often a positive passion, but sometimes a negative passion, like, man, I really hate the way that insurance companies work in healthcare, and, I hate that so much that I'm going to try to fix it, right? You start with that. And then you look at all the business models in the space that potentially support that. And, then you start modeling out, okay, if this did work, what could the impact be? Would we make enough money to make this, worthwhile as an investment and so on? So that's kind of the bridge between the qualitative and the quantitative. The qualitative is like the compass heading, and then the quantitative is, kind of your measurement of progress along that compass heading. But you can't use metrics to choose really what direction you're going into.
And how do you rally your team around these goals while ensure that they're also aligned with that big vision?
Well, I think, basically you want to show how increasing that quantitative metric achieves the qualitative goals. As an example of my previous company, so, now we've done, close to 1 million people, 1 million couples have been tested. And, but, just getting to the first 1,000 couples was this huge deal because, a lot of us had been PhDs working on, genome sequencing and so on before it was even a thing that, was known about in public. And to say, hey, look, all that work that we did in academia, all that, societal investment in the Human Genome Project, it's now actually paying off. Everything that was promised 10 years ago, it's actually paying off. We just need to fix these bugs, and we need to just work overtime for, a few more days, a few more weeks. We get to this 1,000 marker. That's like a magic marker, right? So that's an example of, how you sort of try to say, okay, unless you've actually put it into production and executed on it and actually shipped that many, actual patient samples and done it to a high quality level, you can't say that all the scientific work has actually produced anything. And so in this fashion, you can kind of align the quantitative metric and show how it's achieving the qualitative goals. And of course, it doesn't hurt that quantitative metric, you make, $1,000 for every customer, and you've done 1,000, you've made $1 million, right?
So do you distill the quantitative goals down from like starting at the company's quantitative goals, which to make revenue, right? Essentially. And then do you distill them by department and then by individual to keep everyone kind of motivated so they know that the impact that they're having, or do you take a different approach?
Yeah, so you can do that for a sales team and maybe to some extent for marketing, but it's pretty hard to do for engineering in the sense that, with a sales rep, they have some territory or they have some customer segment and they have a quota, And it's kind of a lone wolfy kind of thing. I mean, salespeople work together to some extent, but for the most part, you have a prospect list, you split it up, and then there's a point of contact. And that person sort of lives or dies, at least that's sales culture, they live or die based on how many you manage to sell. Whereas with engineers, it's the connection to value is much more abstract. It's not as obvious. You can't say this keystroke or this line of code or what have you led to this customer. It's not. It doesn't work quite like that. And then somewhere in the middle is kind of like marketing, where a marketer has a bunch of channels and they have initiatives, and you can track the CAC and you can track the LTV, and you can see whether that marketer's initiatives are paying off. It's not quite as accountable typically as a salesperson, because marketers don't have quota in exactly the same way. But it's closer to them than it is to engineers. So I'd say that, yes, you can certainly kind of make people accountable, but it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because if you are too short-term thinking about that, if every salesperson knows that if they just miss one quarter, then you're going to fire them. Well, okay, you have achieved a short-term goal, but maybe you haven't achieved the long-term cultural goal you'd want, because you want to be able to back those people if they have like one down quarter or what have you. And at the same time, you'd also want them to back you as a company if you had one down quarter, right? So I think that going too capitalistic about it and too quantitative can kind of be a short-term optimization at the expense of the long-term.
What would you say is in your experience, the best way to keep an engineering team engaged and motivated?
Well,
with that in mind?
I would say, engineers are motivated by a few different things. So first is flexible work hours, because, just the ability to work in quiet and peace, or with their headphones, or in a quiet office and so on. So work conditions are important. Second, and this is not necessarily in priority order, but I'm just enumerating them. Second, it's important that they feel that they're doing something meaningful, either from a technological standpoint, like messing around with cool technology, or from a market impact standpoint. And then third, they should like the folks they're around, that there should be a quote culture to the organization. And I know the word culture is hugely overused. Basically, it refers to, what tools are used? Do we go to lunch and dinner? Do we hang out together as a company? And, what things are valued and what things are not valued. All those kinds of things are culture, and often they're not written down, and they're implicit in the relatively small early stages of a startup. And then as you add in more people, those folks have to become acculturated. And if you don't acculturate them and you grow too fast, then you bring in folks from outside that have their own culture, and then it becomes this mainstream culture. And the mainstream is not what built that initial company. So it's very, very important to kind of protect those kind of unwritten behavioral practices, making them written and more formalized over time as the company grows. And that requires the ability to articulate what they are and then actually put them into practice. I know it's a little bit of a digressive answer, but that's how I think about the engineering motivation.
Yeah, I don't want to digress from our focus too much, but any high-level tips for how to maintain that culture, for lack of a better term, is built?
I think doing one-on-ones with people frequently is good to the extent that you can. And once you can't, then you should have your, if you're in CEO, you should have your immediate managers doing one-on-ones, such that every person at the company has a one-on-one with their direct manager at least once a week. And ideally more frequent than that, you're sitting next to them and so on, but a formal one-on-one. And if you do something like that, then you will just have constant touch, and folks will be able to speak what's on their mind and so on. You should get an early warning if things are not going in the right direction.
Switching gears a little bit, from your perspective, what's the future of Bitcoin, and how will it impact tech businesses who are just beginning to scale, if it will even impact them?
Good question. So I think the future of Bitcoin in particular, I think is quite bright. In 2013, and earlier, there's so many different articles that said Bitcoin's going to die, Bitcoin is dead, et cetera, et cetera. There is an issue right now in the community, the so-called, block size or fee issue. I believe that'll be solved. But basically, I think Bitcoin's role at a minimum as a digital gold is, I would say at this point, pretty well established. And, gold's worldwide market cap is $2 trillion, and Bitcoin is only something like, 20 billion right now. So I think just based on the digital gold application, if it's the only thing that you grant that Bitcoin is good for, there's like 100x growth in Bitcoin. And so I think that Bitcoin is going to become a bigger and bigger and bigger deal over time. So I'm pretty bullish on it. I'm also bullish on all the spin-off stuff that Bitcoin has inspired. And there's an enormous amount of it. There's both public and private blockchains. And the distinction is a public blockchain like Bitcoin, like Ethereum and so on, is usually like a currency carrying thing where no one economic entity has the authority to update it. And a private blockchain is something that you'd use within a consortium or potentially even within a single company where it's sort of like an intranet. It's usually measuring transfers of something of value, and it's timestamping them and it's hashing them so you know the order in which things were moved around. But it is something where one economic actor or a few economic actors can choose to rewrite the history or add or grant permissions and whatnot. Then in addition to public and private blockchains, there's all of these spin-off and related decentralized concepts like Filecoin and IPFS, or a new Ethereum name system, or the decentralized apps built on Ethereum, or things like Urbit, which are actually, in some ways predate Bitcoin, but are related to it. There's a bunch of these decentralized technologies that are coming pretty fast, and I think they're going to be at the center of tech over the next decade. And it's going to take a while for that to build, because right now it's just kind of a subculture. But, I'd roughly compare it to where, I don't know, let's say social was in, 04 to 07 or 06. People kind of knew it was getting big. If you were a tech aficionado, you were paying attention to it, but the wider world hadn't had it. And then suddenly within a few years, 1 billion people were on Facebook. And then it became something that social features were baked into every app. I definitely don't think digital currency and blockchains in general and decentralization in the most general and Bitcoin in specific are relevant to every tech business today. But within 5 years, I expect they will be. Let me give you one example. I think that within 5 years, you'll probably see that 10% or more of companies choose to do a token sale in lieu of an angel round. Basically, a token sale, also called a so-called initial coin offering or ICO, it's as if you founded a company and went public on the same day. And so essentially, rather than having angel investors buy your equity, instead what happens is you sell tokens to your new web service. It's sort of like a combination of equity and product crowdfunding, because the token is actually a product. Like Kickstarter, you sell 1,000 copies of your new robot prior to manufacturing it, right? But it also appreciates like equity. So it's in this gray area in between, because it goes up in value as your network goes up in value. So these token sales are currently in extremely bubbly high. The total market cap of crypto is like 55 billion or something. I think that's going to drop off hard. A lot of these coins have been going vertical recently. But I think the concept of doing a token sale in lieu of an angel round is so powerful that it's going to become more and more mainstream. And I think 5 years is probably maybe a conservative time frame for it to be widely adopted. So I think that's going to be one of the first ways in which digital currency becomes very, very mainstream in tech. And then there may be other ways, like, we'll see how successful what we're doing is. But getting people to reply to emails for money is also, I think, a pretty broad application. And if that works, then that'll also introduce another few million or tens of millions of people to digital currency.
This might be an obvious question, but how do you think it will change the system? Kind of like how Facebook changed the way that we communicate and the way we stay in touch, right? What do you think the bigger impact is?
Yeah, so Facebook has a lot of interesting second-order consequences that people don't think about too much. One of them is that the penalty for moving physically has been greatly reduced, because you still keep in touch with all of your friends. And that's something where, 15 years ago, that was not the case. If you moved, you fell out of touch with your friends. Now your friends don't even know that you moved. Literally, you could have moved 3 times and you still keep a Facebook thread with them. And they'd be like, oh, I guess you moved to New York or whatever, right? And they don't even know. So that has meant that Facebook has actually made people much more mobile. And I think the effect of that is yet to be fully felt, but it's something that kind of got baked in. In the same way with digital currency, I think one of the biggest impacts is going to be monetization of lots of things that were previously unmonetizable, especially like fine-grained increments of people's time. Right now, in theory, you have some consulting rate, right? That is to say, you have a set of skills, and in theory, you could probably go and rent out your time, for X amount of dollars. In practice, the liquidity of that market is not very high right now. But if you had sufficient information, it might be possible, just like you can go onto Twitter or, Google News. And if you go to Twitter, you can type in whatever you're interested in. You can find an active discussion and you can go and start fighting about it on Twitter, right? In the same way, it would be interesting if you have some skill and you can just put that in and prove that you have it, and then immediately just starting getting money by doing tasks based on that skill. And you need to build up the marketplace to get to a certain level of liquidity. But this would essentially mean that any downtime that you have, any free time, any spare time, you could convert into money just based on how hard you're willing to work. And that's like a very interesting concept that I think will take some time to get to its full fruition, but it's ultimately kind of the direction we're going, where anybody can turn their spare time into spare money. So if you want to work another 10 hours a week, you can just instantly do so just by clicking more buttons. And so the search cost of finding that kind of piecework is vastly reduced.
I mean, as a freelancer, I definitely understand the impact and benefit of it's essentially inbound leads. It kind of changes the game for everyone, but especially for freelancers.
Yes. And you need to get to a large amount of volume and you need to make that work in one vertical before going out to others. There's lots of logistical questions, but ideally in, I'd say 5 to 10 years, anywhere there's a phone, there's a job.
Right. Yeah, for sure. So this concept of paying or being paid to email or contact someone is really intriguing. And we love that many influential people are donating their piece to causes that they feel is important. What impact has this had in helping founders and investors manage their time and bandwidth?
Yeah, so good question. So, well, first is, we've raised actually quite a lot of money now for Black Girls Code and other, good causes. And I think there's essentially two different kinds of users on our platform. There's the save time people and there's the make money people. And the save time people, they don't want to get a ton of messages, but they are interested in hearing from folks who are willing to pay. Essentially, this is somebody who is, a CEO or they're an investor, and they don't, they get enough messages per day that they don't necessarily want more. However, if somebody's willing to pay them like $100, well, sure, they'll pay attention to that. That might be actually, worth doing. By contrast, the make money people kind of just want to see how much spare cash they can make by answering folks' surveys and emails, right? And essentially, these are folks often who are still actually execs and fairly senior people, but they are just kind of interested to see how far this thing goes, right? And there's the fun part of building up digital currency, of kind of donating to charity in their spare time. And so another way of thinking about it is even a busy exec will often also have a Facebook account. And just like they will accumulate Facebook friends, they can build up a 21 balance. And arguably, the money is more useful than, social stats, like the number of likes on their post or whatever is more evanescent and fleeting than $500 in their account where they could, buy somebody a dinner with that. So I think that those are kind of two different demographics. And basically, I think what it also does is it puts a lot of onus on the sender to actually craft a really good message. And what's interesting is most email nowadays is business-to-business communication because intra-business communication has been taken over by Slack, and intra-personal communication has been taken over by Facebook and Twitter. Facebook for friend to friend, and Twitter for it's personal, but it's not with friends; it's with acquaintances or with folks who share your interest. But business-to-business communication currently still runs on email. However, senders really, really care about getting replies, and all these inside sales teams, all these recruiting teams would spend a lot more effort on making it easy and worth your while to reply if they had the tool chain to do so. And so I think we're starting to fix that market. I don't want to call it a market failure, but let's say that market need right now. And what it does is it means that the sender, because they put in more effort, the receiver has to put in less time and gets more money.
Gotcha. It kind of gamifies. It's like kind of gamifying for a cause for affluent people, essentially. Yeah,
that's right. So basically it means you can kind of donate to charity in your spare time. And so you know what, like raise a few $1,000 in a month, or a year, depending on your traffic. It's pretty good. It's better than nothing.
Yeah. Neat. Switching gears again a bit, would you say that you've established work-life balance as a founder?
Yeah. I mean, I'm married with one child. So I think I have a reasonable work-life balance. I don't have a lot of hobbies outside of tech, so it doesn't really feel too much like work to me. My wife is also into tech, and the child is young, but you should hopefully be into tech too. I do think that if you like to party and do a lot of things that are not work-related, it's hard to do that and do a startup. I do think, however, it's possible to get good sleep, good exercise, and do a company. I don't think it's possible to have an extremely busy nightlife and get good sleep and good exercise and do a company. I don't think all three are that easy.
That makes sense. And plus the good sleep and the exercises help you be more productive anyway, right? Cool. Well, last question. As an experienced founder and a partner at Anderson Horowitz, if you were going to give any piece of advice to founders who are just beginning to scale their business, so let's say past that 30-person mark you talked about at the beginning of our conversation, what would that piece of advice be?
Yeah, so only one piece of advice, I'd say, when they're beginning to scale their business, that probably means there's some metric that's starting to really work, like users or, revenue growth or something like that. I think a very good piece of advice is
especially as a lot of new people come into the company, because that's normally what scaling means, to make sure to include a second measure of quality to compensate for possible gaming of the first metric. For example, if you incentivize salespeople on the basis of revenue, you should also look at customer feedback or churn rate or something like that, or profit. Maybe you want to ideally incentivize salespeople on the basis of profit rather than revenue. Another example is if you try to grow users, you should definitely pay a very close attention to churn, because if you just pay or compensate or incentivize or tell people it's good to get lots of users and you don't measure what is happening to those users and are they churning out, then you're in real trouble. So it's basically very, very important to look at a second measure of quality to compensate for gaming of the first metric.
Awesome. That's a great piece of advice and something we at Gecko Board definitely agree with.
Yeah, and by the way, I should say that doesn't originate with me. It's from Andy Grove of Intel, but I think it's like his book High Output Management just got reissued, and it's got a foreword from Ben Horowitz, who's one of the co-founders of Anderson Horowitz, worth reading.
Yeah, we recently talked to a bunch of people who kind of fit into our buyer persona, and almost all of them recommended it as a read. So I'm glad you brought that up. Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Gecko Board's Secrets for Scaling podcast. If you know of someone who you think would be a great guest for Secrets for Scaling, or if you want to share your own scaling story, email me anytime at shannon@geckoboard.com. We'd love to have you. If you've been enjoying Secrets for Scaling, please consider giving us a review on iTunes. We'd appreciate it.